Let's start off by talking about the relationship between economic freedom and income per capita. I mean, Adam Smith wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations, an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. And he said in The Wealth of Nations that the wealth of the nation will be higher, will be richer if we have a system of natural liberty, or what today I'm going to call economic freedom. So we have data now. We have data on economic freedom from the Economic Freedom Index. We have countries that are very low in freedom, bottom 25%, the red countries. Then we get the blue countries, the countries that have the most economic freedom. And we got the yellows and the greens, they're somewhere in the middle. And we have data on how rich the country is, GDP per capita, income per capita. You get this from the World Bank. It's adjusted for purchasing power. It's the best measure we have of standard of living across countries. It's not perfect, but it's a pretty good measure. If you look at the red countries, the countries with the least amount of economic freedom in the world, countries like Venezuela, and you average the income across the red countries, the bottom quarter of economic freedom, what you see is income is about $6,000, a little over $6,000 per person. As you go to the yellow countries, the next group, the second least free group, it doubles to around, more or less doubles to around $12,000. If you go from yellow to green, green is sort of the upper middle class for economic freedom, then the sort of economically free, but not really that economically free. It doubles again to $25,000. And then when you go from the green to the blue, you go from the second most economically free group to the most economically free group, you more or less double again. So wow, Adam Smith was right. The jury is in. Adam Smith was right. You know, Karl Marx, though, would not have looked at that graph and been surprised either, because Karl Marx actually did know that capitalism, or that's what he called it, capitalism, free markets, he knew that they produced a lot of wealth. Actually, Karl Marx had long passages in his writings about how productive capitalism was, how much stuff, how much income, how much GDP it could produce. The big complaint that Karl Marx had, and people to this day still have, was what? Well, yeah, capitalism produces a lot of stuff. Economic freedom produces a lot of GDP per capita, but it all goes to the rich, right? The problem with economic freedom, according to Marx and Marxists, is the lack of equality. So let's take a look at some data on the poorest 10% of the population and ask what share of the income, what percentage of income. So if you have 100% of the population, let's ignore the top 90%, just look at the bottom 10%. The bottom 10th. What share of income do the people in the bottom 10% receive? Well, I have bad news. Not a lot. That's what it kind of means to be in the bottom 10%. But if you'll notice, if you're in a red country, which is, say, a low economic freedom country, yellow, green, or blue, a high economically free country, looks like somewhere between 2.5%, a little bit lower, a little higher, 2 to 3% of income is being earned by the bottom 10% of the population. It's not a lot. And a lot of people look at that income inequality that we have in this world and they're outraged. They're shocked and outraged. But if you ask the question, is it caused by economic freedom? Are the countries that follow Adam Smith's system of natural liberty, the countries with the lowest taxes and the least regulations and the soundest monetary policies and the freest trade, are those countries the ones with the most inequality? And the answer is no. The countries that regulate a lot, the countries that have high taxes, the countries with the worst monetary systems, by worst I mean the most unstable monetary systems, those countries also have a lot of inequality. There's a lot of inequality in the world. And it seems to be everywhere. It's higher, if you look at individual countries, yes, it's higher in some, lower in others, but it doesn't seem to correlate at all with the kind of economic system you have. This is disappointing. I wish I could tell you how we can fix income inequality. A lot of people are concerned about income inequality. They would like to see a world that was more equal. I just don't really have a great solution for you, but I do know something. I do know that the economic system that you have, whether it's socialist or capitalist or anything in between, doesn't seem to drive income inequality much one way or the other. Now, with that said, where would you rather be in the bottom 10% of a country? In an economically free country or in a not economically free country? Well, the answer is going to speak for itself, I think, when you look at the graph. This is the income level. It's not the share of income, it's the actual level of income that is received by the bottom 10% on average in the red, yellow, green, and blue buckets for economic freedom. The least economically free countries in the world, the average person in the bottom 10% of that population has about $1,700, a few bucks a day. In the blue countries, it's $14,000 per person. That's not a lot of money. If you have $14,000 a year in income in the United States, you are poor. But I'd rather be poor and have $14,000 than poor and have $1,700. So it's unambiguously the case that the poorest of the poor, the bottom of the income distribution, is better off if they're in a blue and therefore richer nation. The philosopher John Rawls, famous philosopher, spent his career at Harvard, probably the most important philosopher of the 20th century, he said you should judge a country by how well it treats the bottom of the bottom, how well it treats the poorest of the poor. Well, if I'm judging countries based on this, which is how well we're treating the poorest of the poor when it comes to income, my judgment would have to be that the blue economically free countries are the more socially just countries, to use the term that John Rawls used. Now, another way of looking at this is poverty data. Poverty data come from the World Bank. The World Bank gives us data on how many people live on certain amounts a day. It's per day. So there's three levels, $2.15 a day, $3.65 a day, or $6.85 a day. What percentage of the population lives on that much or less a day? Well, in the red countries, 32% of the population has less than $2 a day in earnings. 74% have less than $6.85 a day. Feel free to multiply by 365 to see what that turns out to be for a year, but that's a lot of people living on not very much. Whereas again, in the blue countries, the countries with the most economic freedom, you have somewhere between 1 to 5% of the population, between 1 out of 100 to maybe 1 out of 20 people at most, who are living in that kind of level of abject poverty. So a lot less poverty going on in the more economically free countries. Again, if you're a Rawlsian, if you want to think about how we're treating the poorest of the poor, this seems to be evidence in favor of economic freedom. And then the last one I want to talk about is social progress in a more general, broad sense. I could throw up another dozen graphs with infant mortality, environmental quality, women's rights. I have all this, we have a lot of data in this world. There's a group called the Social Progress Initiative, and what the Social Progress Initiative does is they do an index of social progress. It's very much like my Economic Freedom Index. My Economic Freedom Index is trying to measure economic freedom. Their Social Progress Index is trying to measure social progress, and they have in that index something like 60 variables for things like how clean is the environment, how healthy are the people, what's infant mortality, how clean is the water. So they put a lot of variables about social and economic outcomes. They don't put anything in there about GDP per capita, so it's not a measurement of how rich we are, it's just a measure of how we're doing in terms of, well, what they call social progress, but more generally is social and environmental progress situations. Well, they have a 100-point scale on their index, and it's 0 to 100, and good news, economic freedom works here too. So suppose you don't care about income. Suppose income, GDP per capita, that's just what economists care about. I care about, infant mortality. I care about the environment. I care about women's rights. I care about these social goals. Well, there isn't a conflict between economic freedom and social progress measured by these sort of softer measures either. The best measurement we have of social progress, I think, is the Social Progress Index, and it turns out that countries with more economic freedom also have more social progress. So the last thing I want to do is a little bit of a plug. We have a website. Our publisher is the Fraser Institute, which is a think tank in Canada. Our website is FrazierInstitute.org/economic-freedom. Although if you just Google that, you'll probably get to the same place. And on that website, we've got all the data. I mentioned that we have data back to 1970 for many countries. So if you wanted to look at long time trends, if you're a student who's doing work in a class and you're supposed to do a report about Venezuela or any country or whatever, the data are all available, all the Excel spreadsheets. There's a lot of maps. The maps are animated. It's very cool. So I invite you to go check out our website at the Frazier Institute if you want to learn more. So what have we discussed? We've learned how economic freedom can be measured, what economic freedom means. We've learned which countries are the most free and which countries are the least free. And we've learned what it means to be more or less economically free. I want to thank you for listening to my talk about economic freedom of the world. Thank you.